subscribe to the channel. It's easy and fast.
Jessica and Mark had been married for 15 years. They lived in a quiet town in rural Iowa, where everyone knew everyone, and routines were almost sacred. They had 2 children, Emma, 13 years old, and Noah, 9. Jessica was an English teacher at the local school, respected by parents and admired by students. Mark, on the other hand, worked as a construction worker, always with calloused hands and a sweaty face, but with enormous pride in taking care of his family. The couple's life seemed stable in the eyes of others. On weekends, they had barbecues in the backyard, went to church on Sundays, and participated in their children's school activities. But behind the appearance of a model family, there was a growing emptiness between them. Their town, Meadowbrook, was one of those places where time seemed to move at a different pace than the rest of the world. Main Street consisted of a dozen shops, a diner that served the same menu it had for 40 years, and a church whose steeple could be seen from almost anywhere in town. Population signs boasted just over 3,000 residents, though everyone knew the actual number was closer to 2,500 after the mill closed 5 years ago. Jessica had grown up 2 towns over in a similar community and had moved to Meadowbrook when she accepted the teaching position at Meadowbrook High School fresh out of college. Mark was a local boy, born and raised, the son of a farmer who had lost his land during the agricultural crisis of the 80s. They had met at a county fair, a whirlwind romance that led to marriage within a year and the birth of Emma shortly after. For the first several years, their marriage had been solid. Not perfect, no marriage ever is, but genuine. They laughed together, supported each other's dreams, and built a life brick by brick, much like the houses Mark constructed. Jessica loved watching Mark with the children when they were little, the way his rough hands could be so gentle when braiding Emma's hair or helping Noah tie his shoes. But somewhere along the way, the laughter had faded. The conversations had become transactional, focused on bills and schedules and who would pick up the kids from soccer practice. Jessica couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when they had stopped being partners and started being merely cohabitants, but she felt the shift like a constant ache. Jessica felt increasingly distant from Mark. He left early for work, came back late, tired, often without energy to talk. The moments of intimacy between them became rare, and gestures of affection disappeared from their routine. She never stopped loving him, but she began to feel alone, as if she were just a house employee, taking care of the children and her classes. Mark, for his part, was drowning in his own way. The construction business had been struggling. The town's economic decline meant fewer new homes, fewer renovations, more competition for the jobs that did exist. He took contracts further and further from home, driving an hour or more each way just to secure work. The financial pressure weighed on him constantly, and he brought that stress home, like dust from the construction site, invisible to the eye, but coating everything. He noticed Jessica's distance but misinterpreted it. He thought she was disappointed in him as a provider, ashamed that he couldn't give her the life she deserved. So he worked harder, stayed longer, pushed himself to exhaustion trying to prove his worth. He didn't realize that what she needed wasn't more money, it was more of him. It was during the school training sessions that Jessica grew closer to Tyler, the new physical education teacher. Young, charismatic, good-humored, and full of energy, Tyler attracted attention wherever he went, including Jessica's. At first, they were just quick conversations in the hallway or during class breaks. But their affinity grew, and soon they began exchanging messages. What seemed like a light and fun friendship evolved into something more intense and dangerous. Tyler had arrived in Meadowbrook that fall, fresh from a larger school district in Des Moines. At 28, he was 7 years younger than Jessica, unmarried and seemingly unencumbered by the weight that pressed down on everyone else in town. He had stories about traveling, about concerts in the city, about a life beyond the boundaries of small-town existence. To Jessica, he represented possibility, a reminder of the person she used to be before she became defined solely by her roles as wife, mother, and teacher. The conversation started innocently enough. Tyler was new, and needed guidance navigating the school's culture and politics. Jessica, as a veteran teacher, was happy to help. They discovered shared interests, a love of classic literature, an appreciation for indie music, a similar sense of humor that ran toward the sardonic. He made her laugh in a way she hadn't laughed in years. The messages began casually. A funny observation about a faculty meeting, a recommendation for a book, a shared complaint about the photocopier that never worked. But gradually the tone shifted. The messages came more frequently. They stayed up late texting, sharing thoughts they couldn't express to anyone else. Jessica found herself checking her phone constantly, her heart rate quickening whenever she saw his name on the screen. She knew it was wrong. She knew she was crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. But she couldn't seem to stop herself. Tyler saw her, really saw her, in a way she hadn't felt seen in years. He asked about her thoughts, her feelings, her dreams. He remembered details of their conversations. He noticed when she changed her hair or wore a new outfit. Small things, perhaps, but they felt enormous to someone who had become invisible in her own home. The affair between Jessica and Tyler lasted several months. They met at alternative times, often during school planning periods or on afternoons when Mark was at work and the children had extracurricular activities. For Jessica, it was an escape, a way to feel desired, alive. For Tyler, it was an involving passion, though imprudent. Their first kiss happened on a Thursday afternoon in her empty classroom. The janitors had already made their rounds, and most teachers had gone home. Tyler had stopped by to return a book she'd lent him, and somehow, in the discussion that followed, they found themselves standing too close, looking at each other too long. When their lips met, Jessica felt a jolt of electricity mixed with terror. This was real now. This was happening. After that, the boundaries dissolved entirely. They became reckless, meeting in his apartment when they could. In her car parked behind the old grain elevator on the edge of town. Once even in the supply closet near the gym, when desperation and opportunity aligned. The thrill of secrecy became intoxicating, a drug that made her feel young and reckless, and free from the responsibilities that normally defined her existence. Jessica told herself elaborate lies to justify what she was doing. Her marriage was already over in all but name. She deserved happiness. Mark didn't appreciate her anyway. Tyler understood her in ways Mark never could. She wasn't hurting anyone as long as no one found out. The lies felt convincing in the moments when Tyler's arms were around her, when she could forget about everything else and just exist in the present. But guilt has a way of seeping through even the most carefully constructed justifications. Jessica found herself snapping at her children over small things, her patience worn thin by the constant stress of maintaining her double life. She avoided Mark's eyes during the rare moments when they were in the same room, afraid he would somehow see the truth written on her face. She threw herself into lesson planning and grading with obsessive intensity, using work as a shield against her own thoughts. Emma, perceptive as teenagers are, noticed something was off. She asked her mother several times if everything was okay, if she and Dad were fighting. Jessica brushed off the concerns with practiced ease, assuring her daughter that everything was fine, just stress from work. But Emma's worried eyes followed her mother around the house, seeing more than Jessica realized. But secrets don't last forever, especially in small towns. It was Noah who innocently planted the seed of suspicion. During a Sunday lunch, he mentioned casually, without malice, that he had seen his mother leaving school with Uncle Tyler, even outside of school hours. Mark at first didn't suspect anything serious, but the scene remained etched in his mind. In the following days, he began to pay more attention to his wife's schedule, to the messages on the cell phone left on the kitchen counter, to the excuses that previously hadn't drawn attention. The comment had been simple enough. Noah had been at a friend's house after school for a playdate, and the friend's mother had brought him home early due to her son feeling sick. As they drove past the school, Noah had spotted his mother's car still in the parking lot, and someone who looked like Mr. Harrison, the PE teacher, getting into it. He mentioned it to Mark the way children mention anything, without understanding the weight it might carry. Mark tried to dismiss it. Of course, Jessica stayed late at school sometimes. Teachers had meetings, grading to do, 1,000 reasons to be there after hours. And Tyler was a colleague. It made sense they might walk out together, maybe even carpooling if one of their vehicles wasn't working. But the thought lodged itself in his brain like a splinter, small but impossible to ignore. He started noticing things he had previously overlooked. The way Jessica's face lit up when her phone buzzed, then immediately fell when she saw it wasn't the message she'd hoped for. The new care she took with her appearance in the mornings, the subtle makeup she hadn't bothered with in years, the defensive tone in her voice when he asked about her day, the way she angled her phone screen away from him when typing. Mark hated himself for the suspicion. He felt like he was betraying his wife by even thinking these thoughts. Jessica was a good woman, a devoted mother, a respected teacher. She would never do something like that, would she? But the doubt, once planted, grew like poison ivy, spreading through his mind until he couldn't think of anything else. He found himself driving past the school at odd hours, checking to see if her car was there. He watched her interactions with male colleagues at school, events with new scrutiny. He lay awake at night while she slept beside him, wondering if the woman he had married was still the woman sharing his bed. The truth came to light brutally. Mark discovered a compromising exchange of messages between Jessica and Tyler. Photos, declarations, plans. Mark's world collapsed. It happened on a Tuesday evening. Jessica had left her phone charging in the kitchen while she helped Emma with a history project upstairs. Mark had walked past it, intending to pour himself another cup of coffee, when the screen lit up with a new message. He wouldn't have looked. He wasn't that kind of person, didn't believe in invading privacy, but Tyler's name on the screen stopped him in his tracks. The preview of the message showed only the first line, "I can't stop thinking about this afternoon." Mark's hands shook as he picked up the phone. He knew Jessica's passcode. It was Emma's birthday. She had never bothered to hide it from him because they had nothing to hide from each other. Or so he had thought. What he found in that message thread shattered 15 years of marriage in an instant. Messages going back months. Declarations of desire, of longing, of love. Photos that no husband should ever see of his wife. Plans to meet, detailed discussions of when and where. Complaints about how Mark didn't understand her, didn't appreciate her. Inside jokes that had been shared between them, now shared with someone else. Mark sat down heavily in a kitchen chair, the phone still in his hands, reading message after message, each one a knife to his heart. He felt sick, dizzy, like the floor had disappeared beneath him. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But the evidence was right there, glowing on the screen in blue and white text bubbles. The reaction was explosive but not violent. Mark confronted Jessica in the living room, away from the children, demanding the truth. She, with no way out, confessed everything. She cried, asked for forgiveness, said she still loved him. But the damage was done. Jessica came downstairs to find Mark sitting on the couch, her phone placed carefully on the coffee table between them. One look at his face and she knew. The color drained from her own face as she saw what was displayed on the screen. "How long?" His voice was quiet, dead, nothing like the Mark she knew. "Mark, please, let me explain." "How long?" "A few months." "Mark, please, it didn't mean anything." The laugh that escaped him was bitter, broken. "It didn't mean anything?" "Jessica, I just read you telling another man you love him." "I saw—" He couldn't continue, couldn't force the words out. Jessica sank into the chair across from him, tears streaming down her face. She tried to explain, to make him understand the loneliness she had felt, the distance between them, how Tyler had made her feel seen again. But even as the words left her mouth, she heard how hollow they sounded, how selfish, how insufficient to explain the devastation she had caused. Mark listened in silence, his face a mask of pain. When she finished, he asked only one question. "Do you love him?" Jessica hesitated, and in that hesitation, Mark found his answer. "I want you to end it," he said finally. "Tonight, right now. Send him a message and tell him it's over. Then delete his number, block him, and never speak to him again." Jessica nodded, her hands trembling as she picked up the phone and typed out a brief message to Tyler. "We're done. Don't contact me again. My husband knows." She showed the message to Mark before sending it, then blocked Tyler's number as Mark watched. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Mark, I'm so sorry." But Mark had already stood up and walked toward the stairs. "I'm sleeping in the guest room," he said without turning around. "Don't follow me." The news spread rapidly through town. The school suspended Tyler for improper conduct with a married colleague. Even though it was a relationship between adults, the school environment was considered inappropriate for this type of involvement. The administration, concerned about the institution's reputation, encouraged his resignation. He ended up leaving town weeks later, pressured by shame and the stares of residents. The school board held an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. While technically both parties were adults, and their relationship occurred outside of school hours, the optics were terrible. Parents were calling, concerned about the moral character of the staff. The superintendent was particularly worried about the potential scandal affecting school funding and enrollment. Tyler was called into a meeting with the principal and superintendent. They laid out the situation clearly. He could resign voluntarily, receiving a neutral reference that wouldn't mention the affair, or they would begin termination proceedings that would become part of his permanent record and likely make it difficult for him to find another teaching position anywhere. Tyler, his face pale and drawn, asked if Jessica was facing the same ultimatum. The uncomfortable silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. She had tenure, 15 years of exemplary service, deep community roots. He was a newcomer, easily disposable, the perfect scapegoat. The injustice of it burned, but he understood the calculus. Small towns protected their own, and he had never been one of their own. He signed the resignation letter that afternoon. Within days, the story had spread through Meadowbrook like wildfire. The coffee shop buzzed with whispered conversations that fell silent when Jessica or Mark entered. The grocery store checkout lines became opportunities for careful information gathering, questions disguised as concern. People claimed to have seen signs all along, though none had said anything at the time. Jessica, even while keeping her job, became the target of comments and judgments. Colleagues distanced themselves, parents of students began to look with suspicion, and even Emma and Noah faced embarrassing situations at school. The home, once harmonious, became a field of silence and resentment. The first time Emma came home crying because girls in her class had been whispering about her cheating mom, loud enough for her to hear, Jessica felt something break inside her that she knew would never fully heal. She tried to explain to her daughter to help her understand, but what could she say? How do you explain to your 13-year-old child that you betrayed everything the family stood for? Noah, younger and less aware of the full implications, sensed the tension and retreated into himself. He became quieter, spending more time in his room, his grades beginning to slip. When Jessica asked if he was okay, he would just nod and change the subject, but she could see the confusion and hurt in his eyes. At school, Jessica's classes became ordeals. Students, who had once hung on her every word during discussions of literature, now sat in stony silence or snickered behind their hands. Parents requested transfers to other English teachers. The principal, while not firing her, made it clear that she was on thin ice and any further incidents would result in her termination. The other teachers treated her with cold politeness, excluding her from lunch groups and after-school gatherings. The only person who still spoke to her with any warmth was Margaret, a veteran science teacher who had weathered her own scandal years ago when her husband left her for his secretary. "They'll move on eventually," Margaret told her one afternoon in the faculty lounge. "Some new drama will come along and you'll become old news. But it takes time and it's not easy." Mark withdrew emotionally. He slept in another room, avoided long dialogues, and began to spend more time away from home. Despite the pain, he decided not to ask for divorce immediately because of the children. But the bond between him and Jessica was never the same again. Mark threw himself into work with a desperate intensity, taking jobs further away, working longer hours, anything to avoid being home. When he was there, he moved through the house like a ghost, present in body but absent in every way that mattered. He couldn't look at Jessica without seeing her betrayal. Every room held memories that were now tainted, recontextualized through the lens of her affair. He tried, for the children's sake, to maintain some semblance of normalcy. He still attended Emma's volleyball games and Noah's soccer matches, though he now sat separately from Jessica rather than beside her. He still helped with homework when asked, though the easy jokes and casual affection that used to characterize these moments were gone. At night, lying alone in the guest room that had become his permanent bedroom, Mark cycled through rage and grief and betrayal and self-blame. What had he done wrong? How had he failed as a husband to push her into another man's arms? Could he have prevented this if he had been more attentive, more present, more romantic? But then the anger would return. She had made a choice. She could have talked to him about her unhappiness. She could have suggested counseling. She could have done literally anything other than carrying on a months-long affair. The betrayal wasn't just about the physical act. It was about every lie, every deception, every moment she had looked him in the eye and pretended everything was fine while carrying on with Tyler behind his back. His friends noticed the change in him. At the bar after work, they would ask if everything was okay. Mark would force a smile and say he was just tired, just stressed about work. He couldn't bring himself to tell them the truth, couldn't bear to see the pity in their eyes, or worse, hear them say they'd always thought something was off about Jessica. Over time, the house became just a structure, like the ones Mark built every day, but without emotional foundation. Jessica lived with the weight of her choice, not just for the betrayal, but for everything that crumbled around her. The marriage, the children's trust, her own image before the community. Jessica found herself going through the motions of daily life in a fog of regret and shame. She woke up, made breakfast for children who barely spoke to her, taught classes to students who despised her, came home to a husband who couldn't stand to be in the same room as her. This was her life now, and she had no one to blame but herself. She thought about Tyler sometimes, wondering if he ever thought about her, if he regretted what they had done. She had heard he'd gotten a teaching position in another state, starting over somewhere no one knew his story. She envied him that possibility of reinvention, even as she recognized the injustice of how he'd been treated while she'd been allowed to stay. Late at night, when the house was silent and dark, Jessica would lie in her bed, the bed she used to share with Mark, and cry quietly into her pillow. She mourned the loss of her marriage, the damage to her children, the respect of her community. But most of all, she mourned the person she used to be, the woman who had prided herself on her integrity and honor. That woman was gone, destroyed by her own choices. She tried, repeatedly, to talk to Mark about their future. Should they try counseling? Should they separate? Should they divorce? But Mark refused to engage with these questions. He was trapped in a state of limbo, unable to forgive but unwilling. To leave, staying for the children, but dying inside a little more each day. Their story became marked as one more of those silent tragedies of the interior, where everyone knows, but no one speaks openly, where appearances continue, but pain lives inside. Meadowbrook moved on, as small towns do, but the ghost of the scandal lingered. At church, Jessica sat in the back pews instead of her usual spot near the front. At parent-teacher conferences, there was always a slight awkwardness when she had to speak with families who knew her story. At the grocery store, conversations still stopped when she walked down an aisle. Emma, resilient in the way teenagers can be, eventually found her footing again. She made new friends, threw herself into volleyball, and slowly rebuilt her life. But she never quite looked at her mother the same way. The pedestal had shattered, and even though she still loved Jessica, there was now always a distance between them, a wariness that hadn't existed before. Noah, younger and more sheltered, adapted more easily on the surface, though Mark worried about what wounds might be hidden deeper, what trust issues might emerge in his future relationships because of what he'd witnessed in his parents' marriage. Years would pass. Emma would go to college, then Noah. The house would grow quieter, the silence no longer filled with the chaos of children, but instead echoing with all the words left unspoken between Jessica and Mark. They would continue their separate existences under one roof, bound together by history and habit and the lingering question of whether either had the energy to start over. Jessica would carry her guilt like a physical weight, a constant companion that colored every interaction and every quiet moment. She would wonder, on her darkest days, if she would spend the rest of her life paying for those few months of feeling alive, of feeling seen, of feeling like something other than just a teacher, just a mother, just a wife. Mark would carry his hurt like armor, protecting himself from further pain by never fully opening up again. He would go through the motions of life, work, home, sleep, repeat. But the joy would be gone, replaced by a resignation to endure rather than to live. And in Meadowbrook, Iowa, population 2,531, their story would fade into the background noise of community law. Just another cautionary tale whispered over coffee. Just another example of how secrets always surface. Just another reminder that, in small towns, the cost of mistakes is measured not just in personal suffering, but in public shame that never quite fades away. The weight of silent tragedy indeed.
Subscribe to the channel. It's easy and fast.